So, hello, Mary. Hello, Alan. Thanks for being a part of this conversation about the U.S. elections. Let me start by introducing Alan Abramovitz. He's a professor of political science at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He received his PhD from Stanford University in 1976 and has authored or co-authored 6 books, dozens of contributions to edited volumes, and more than 60 articles in political science journals dealing with political parties, elections, and voting behavior in the United States. He's also, and that's one of the reasons why we invited him for this conversation, he's also one of the nation's leading forecasters of presidential and congressional elections. In 2018, his generic ballot model correctly predicted that Democrats would regain control of the House of Representatives while Republicans would retain control of the Senate in the midterm elections. So welcome, Alan.
Hi.
To be with you.
And also we have Mary Stegmaier with us. Hi, Mary. She's an associate professor and vice provost for international programs at the University of Missouri. Her research focuses on elections and voting behavior in the US and Europe, about which she has published a large number of widely cited works. Dr. Stegmaier currently serves at the chair of APSA Political Forecasting Group and as associate editor at the International Journal of Forecasting. Pedro.
So very well. So the first question I would like to ask is, what is this thing called election forecasting? And the reason why I ask this is because I think there's a bit of a confusion among the public about different sorts of things. You have election polls, of course, both national at the state level, but you also have forecasts that are made on the basis of those polls, like The Economist has something like this, and of course 538, something like that. There's also prediction markets, and then there's the kind of work that both of you do. So I probably start with Mary. What is election forecasting? What makes it different from other sorts of ways of trying to divine the election result?
Mm-hmm. Well, the most common way that citizens are familiar with looking toward who will win the election is public opinion polls. And public opinion polls are snapshots at that point in time, often of what the national popular vote might be, where political science forecasts of the elections will take into account sort of fundamentals of what we know will move voters in an election. It's a way for us to test and apply what we know about voting behavior to try to forecast the outcome of an election. And so our forecasting models oftentimes will take into account public opinion polls, presidential approval, also economic conditions in a country, different kinds of trends. We might consider whether a president is a first-term president, whether it's an open seat contest. So different fundamentals that oftentimes move the public and help us predict the results of the election.
Alan, what's your take on this? I suppose similar, but do you want to add something?
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One other important difference I would say between most of our political science forecasting models and the kinds of election predictions that most people are familiar with from public opinion polling or from looking at something like Nate Silver's 538 is that generally we want to be able to make our forecasts in advance. In other words, the whole idea is to be able to make a reasonably accurate prediction well before the election actually takes place. Obviously, the closer you get to the election, the easier it is, or at least it should be, to make an accurate forecast. So with something like the 538 model, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, there is no cutoff. I mean, they are updating that prediction every day. You can find a new forecast. Of course, it doesn't usually change much from day to day, but they do update it over time, right up until the day of the election itself. which means there's no lead time. So we're interested in the lead time of the forecast as one of the factors that we will take into account in evaluating any forecasting model.
To ask you, how are forecasting models taking into account the possible divergence between the winner of the national vote and the Electoral College? Is this divergence mostly an anomaly, and can it be discarded or not? Can you help us explain this difference and the importance of this thing? Mary, you first. Thanks.
Yes, I'm happy to take this question, or at least start with this question. It is an important distinction in American politics and in understanding who wins the presidency. So the national popular vote, this is of interest to us who wins this, and that's what the national polls are giving us a snapshot of. But ultimately, who wins the presidency is determined by the Electoral College. And so looking at who is expected to win in either each of the states, since that's how the Electoral College vote is determined, or forecasting the Electoral College votes. So political science forecasts of the election, some of them do begin with forecasting the national vote, but many of them then also, as a second step, will try to forecast the Electoral College vote. There's some other models that are at the state level, so they try to predict who is going to win in each state or account for state characteristics, and then forecast the Electoral College vote based on that.
Yeah. Alan, if I might, 4 years ago we had a slightest problem with this difference, right? So the Hillary Clinton actually won on the national vote, but lost on the college. So what happened was that Donald Trump was surprisingly or not elected president. So do you think in this particular election this can be again a problem?
So I would say, first of all, that most political science forecasting models in the past have focused on predicting the national popular vote and have not been too concerned with the electoral vote. And that's mainly because historically, there's been a very, very strong relationship between the popular vote and the electoral vote. If you look at the relationship over a long series of elections, it's a very close correspondence. However, what we've discovered recently is that when the popular vote margin becomes fairly narrow, as it was in both 2000 and in 2016, then there can be what we call an electoral college misfire, where the electoral vote winner can be different from the popular vote winner. So this is a problem for forecasting models, and there are different ways of trying to deal with that. One is to try to simply forecast the electoral vote rather than the popular vote. The other is to build up your forecast of the electoral college vote from the state by state. So you take polling data and other data on state election results, and from that, you try to project the winner in each state. And from the winner in each state, you can then project the electoral college vote. And that's basically what the 538 model does, and what some of the other poll-based models are doing right now. They're using mainly state polling results combined with information about past election results in the state to try to project the outcome in each state, and then build up from that to project the national electoral vote winner. Either one of those approaches, though, has the same problem, which is that polling errors can lead to misestimates of the electoral college vote. And I believe there's a certain inherent unpredictability of the electoral college. When the national popular vote margin gets within a fairly narrow range where the margin is, say, under 2 or 3 percentage points, then there's this sort of zone of uncertainty where we can't be sure about the results of the electoral what the electoral vote is going to be. And that's what happened in 2000. That's what happened in 2016, which was sort of on the very outer range of that. I believe, that Hillary Clinton won the national popular vote by just over 2 percentage points. Donald Trump won the electoral vote because he was able to eke out very, very narrow wins in several closely contested states.
Yeah, if I might add a question on that. Is it possible to say that the polls are this time, 4 years after what happened, more accurate in measuring this college electorate?
We'll know that in about 4 weeks.
That's a precise answer.
We know that many of the polling organizations have changed their approach somewhat following the errors that occurred in 2016, mainly at the state level. The national polls are actually pretty accurate in 2016, but the polls in some of the swing states were off the mark and generally underestimated Trump's vote share in those swing states. And there's been a great deal of work done since then trying to understand what went wrong. There was a large study of this sponsored by the American Association for Public Opinion Research that looked into some of the sources of error. And there have been some changes, particularly in the ways in which polling organizations try to identify likely voters, for one thing. And also in understanding that it's important to continue polling up until the day of the election, if possible. Because part of what happened in 2016, part of the reason for the errors is that in some states, the final polls were conducted several days before the election or up to a week before the election. And we know that there was a late movement toward Trump among undecided and third-party voters. And that was part of the problem in 2016. But mainly the polls in some of the swing states underestimated the turnout of certain voter groups, particularly non-college educated white voters. And these were voters who voted heavily for Donald Trump.
Mary, yeah.
I was
Go
going
ahead.
to say, Alan's point about the challenge of estimating who turns out to vote on election day, who are likely voters, is an inherent source of error in public opinion polls, but it's also a challenge to figure out how the undecided voters, if they do turn out to the polls, how they will vote. And I think in this election, this year with the pandemic and so many more people voting early, absentee, this will also change the dynamic for pollsters because they will be polling. Some people will already have voted and more people may be heading to the polls. So this may mean the polls could be more accurate if they have a larger sample of people who have already turned out to vote and have cast their ballot. But the pandemic adds another element of uncertainty to the public opinion polls this year.
Mary, you have done a lot of work on the economy and voting behavior. I wanted to ask you, in these forecasting models, almost all of them, some economic variable plays an important role. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that. What aspects of the economy, what variables are more decisive or at least more used in these models, and why?
So one common measure that's used is economic growth. This is a broad, encompassing economic measure that we know helps explain presidential approval ratings. It also helps us in forecasting. Other types of measures that are used are measures that are indices, that are combining a variety of economic measures to get an overall perspective on the state of the economy. So a leading economic indicators, for example, type of measure. There's one, Brad Lockerbie, in his forecast, he focuses on the future and how whether people are optimistic or pessimistic about the future economy. So this gets into the question of, are voters retrospective? Do they look to see what has happened in the last year or last 4 years under the presidency, or are they looking to the future in a campaign and as they consider the presidential candidates?
David.
Okay, I might move on, but still on economy. Maybe, Alan, I'd ask you first. How should we think about the economy in a context of a major crisis such as one we're experiencing right now? Is there any precedent we might learn from? Is this incumbent likely to be held less accountable given the current extraordinary circumstances? May this president be accountable for this crisis in particular?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. So one of the problems with trying to forecast the 2020 presidential election is that there are two aspects of it that I think are quite unprecedented. One is the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has had on the economy. So we're dealing with a major economic downturn, but that economic downturn was deliberately induced as a way to try to control the pandemic. So that makes it very different from previous economic downturns. And I don't think we've ever dealt with a situation like this with regard to the economy. That creates a problem in itself and has led me to decide that it's not reasonable to include the typical measures of economic performance in a forecasting model this year. The other factor that is unprecedented is Donald Trump. I believe in many ways Donald Trump, his approach to the presidency is fundamentally different from that of previous American presidents. And particularly with regard to his approach to trying to grow his electoral coalition, given that he won the presidency in 2016 by a very, very narrow margin, and by winning the electoral vote while losing the popular vote. But Trump, unlike previous presidents, has clearly been determined to focus on maintaining the support of his own party's base, energizing that base, and making little or no effort to expand his support beyond it. And for that reason, I think that calls into question the whole notion of an electoral advantage for a first-term incumbent president, which is what we've seen in past presidential elections.
Mary, you want to add something about this? Let me ask you the same question, but in a different way. If we were to say that the economy would have the same sort of effect in this election than it had in previous elections, it will be a landslide, right? But that's not necessarily what you should expect. I think that's Alan's point. I want to know if you agree with this.
I do agree with Alan's point, and maybe just to offer a slightly different perspective on why that's the case. When we look at President Trump's approval rating over the course of his time in office, the last 4 years, it has been remarkably stable. It has been remarkably stable when the economy was improving. It's been quite stable during the course of this pandemic. And given the size of the economic crisis that we're in, especially the dramatic decline in the growth rate, the increase in unemployment, we would expect a president to really be punished for this at the polls, and also in approval ratings. And we just don't see that happening when we look at either the approval ratings or the polls on who people expect will be, who they intend to vote for on election day.
Okay.
In fact, when you look at the approval rating on the economy, Trump gets his strongest ratings on his handling of the economy. He gets much lower ratings when it comes to other issues, particularly his handling of the pandemic itself. So I think that's another reason for suspecting that the economy is not going to have the same sort of impact on this election that it normally has.
Precisely, Professor. I was heading to that crossroad precisely. That is this president, as you said, has a great evaluation on economic side, and one of the worst of this evaluation is precisely on the pandemic question. So. Let me head to the handling of the pandemic. How do you see that playing out? Is this the most important factor right now at the polls, meaning at the mindset of the American people? If I was making some polls to this election, I really wouldn't know which way to look first. If we look at the undecided voter, which can be bigger in deciding the vote?
I think the pandemic is weighing very heavily on people's minds, but perhaps it matters what party people are affiliating with. So for people who consider themselves Democrats, the pandemic and the response to the pandemic and the lack of national response to COVID-19, where it's really been the states that have been responsible for policy, whether it's mask mandates or other kinds of shutdowns that are happening. So this matters quite a bit to Democrats. To Republicans, it really depends upon how they view the severity of the pandemic, whether they see this as something that's overblown, and how they view the president's approach to this, which has been very hands-off and sort of demonstrating his own thought that the American people are strong and resilient, and therefore we don't need to worry about the virus.
Ellen, I'd like to hear on this also, because precisely because the electorate is so polarized and information so siloed, people's evaluations might be completely determined by partisanship.
So partisanship is the single most powerful predictor of people's evaluations of Donald Trump's performance as president overall, and in just about any issue area that you look at. Nevertheless, what we do see is that overall the public's assessment of his handling of the pandemic is far worse than its assessment of his handling of the economy. And what we also see is that the assessment of Trump's handling of the pandemic is a much stronger predictor of his overall evaluation than the evaluation of his handling of the economy. So it's a very unusual situation, because typically the economy is the single strongest predictor of presidential evaluations. But when you're dealing with a pandemic that has already resulted in a massive loss of life, of well over 200,000 people in this country, and millions of people being sickened, it's, I guess, not surprising that that turns out to be overall the strongest predictor of how people evaluate Trump's presidency. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem that he faces. The assessments of his handling of the economy have remained generally positive, although they've declined somewhat over time. The assessments of his handling of the pandemic have, except for a brief period in the early spring when people felt that he was taking it more seriously, but then afterwards it became clear that he really wasn't acting on it very effectively. The assessments turned very negative, and they've remained very negative ever since then. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem that he faces. There is a big divide along party lines, but overall the assessments are quite negative. So what it looks like is that what Democrats have a very negative assessment. Republicans, much more positive. Independents tend to be fairly negative. And that's what's driving his overall ratings down. And his standing in the polls has actually been falling in recent weeks, in part, I think, as a result of his handling of the pandemic, in part as a result of voter perceptions of his conduct, his personal conduct, that I think were especially focused in the first presidential debate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mary, we might be heading to a second wave of the pandemic, and we are in kind of a strange new election type in which, by the force of the pandemic, many states allowed more mailing votes, absentee voting. May I ask you if you think, in terms of the turnout in mail absentee voting, if you see that this in relation to the existing forecasts may change it? Is there by any chance that these unusual circumstances might affect significantly the results?
So the increased opportunities for voters to vote absentee or mail-in will likely mean that we have quite higher turnout than we might typically see. Gives voters more opportunities to actually turn out and vote because they can do so early. But some of this will also depend upon what happens on election day, because it seems that Democrats are more likely to be voting early than Republicans. And if the pandemic, if we head into a second surge, this might have an impact on people's willingness to turn out on election day or stand in long lines or interact with the community. It may also mean that some people who might have hoped to vote on election day may themselves have COVID or might need to be quarantining because they have been exposed to someone. And so it's really hard to predict the future right now, as it has been over the past 7 months. But in terms of the forecasts, the political science forecasts, most of the forecasts were created and the predictions estimated in the late summer. And so that the actual forecasts are not going to be impacted by what's happening in the next couple of weeks, though it could have an impact on their accuracy. Another part of this, though, is that with the increase in absentee ballots, this means that there are many more voters who are voting for the very first time absentee. And the absentee voting process, there are specific rules and regulations that need to be followed in each state that can vary a little bit from state to state, that voters, it's important for voters to be reading the instructions when they get their absentee ballot, to pay attention to what they can do if they make a mistake on their ballot, to pay attention to whether they need to put their ballot in a secrecy sleeve, to make sure that they are signing their ballot or getting it notarized before they submit it. Because with the increase in absentee voting, we can expect to also see an increase in invalid ballots or ballots that can't be counted because they're missing some piece of the process for casting such a ballot.
I wanted to ask you a question that has a little bit to do with the fact that we have David, who's a journalist, and myself, a political scientist. Journalists care about news, they care about events, they care about the campaign, and very often political scientists, especially if they're doing forecasts, they tend to rely on what you've called fundamentals. And in fact, they tend to present their forecasts way before the campaign ends. So I mean, it's not impossible that both things matter. But for example, the fact that the president tested positive, do you see that as playing any fundamental role, any important role, or do all those events, in the sense, kind of cancel each other, and what matters is the fundamentals, meaning basic approval or the state of the economy? I would ask Alan, for example, and then we can hear Mary.
So that's a great question. And you're exactly right that the political science forecasting models, for the most part, are based on fundamentals or things that are pretty much set before the main part of the general election campaign begins. And we found that, in fact, you can come up with reasonably accurate forecasts because campaigns usually don't have a big impact. Usually they sort of cancel each other out. However, I would say that that's not entirely true. Certainly, it is possible that events can take place during the campaign season, let's say between September and in the months of September and October after the forecasts have been made, that could have an impact. So in this case, the president's diagnosis with COVID might qualify as such an event, although so far it doesn't seem to have had much of an impact because people's opinions on this, as on so many things, tend to divide along party lines and sort of reinforce the divisions that already exist in the electorate. I would say that one event so far does seem to have moved the needle at least a little bit. And that's rather surprising because it's something that doesn't usually have that much of an effect. And that was the first presidential debate. Debates typically don't have much of an effect. Voters already have their minds made up. They come away believing the things they believed prior to the debate about the candidates. But in this case, it's pretty clear, I think, if you look at the polling trends, that before the debate, Trump's average margin in national polls, Biden's average margin over Trump was somewhere in the order of about 7 points, maybe 7 to 8. And now, in the aftermath of that debate, it's more like 10 points. So that's a pretty significant shift. Now, it may not last. It's possible that by the time we get to the end of the month, that short-term boost that Biden got from the debate, and it was mainly because of Trump's rather unusual behavior during the debate. That may fade. But so far, at least, that does seem to have had at least a modest impact, which could sort of turn this from a relatively close election, or one in which Biden might win by a comfortable but not a landslide margin, to one that comes close to a landslide margin.
Mary, what's your take on this?
Yes, so Alan is absolutely right. As forecasters, we believe in the fundamentals, but and oftentimes the campaign events will cancel each other out. But I would say most of us also believe in campaigns, that campaigns are important, sharing of information, and greater knowledge of what the candidates stand for, how they will comport themselves in public, in debates, for example, or in diplomacy. And in this case, as is often the case, we don't necessarily see much movement, or if we do see movement, it's temporary movement. And with the case with the debates, I mean, it's been decided that there won't be any additional presidential debates. So the impact of the first debate may actually wear off. There are also other big issues that are happening in the United States beyond just the pandemic and the state of the economy, though those are major ones. There are also race relations issues that the president, in some of his comments about white extremist groups and his unwillingness to speak out against racism has not fared well with a certain section of the population. Also, there are additional issues like the Supreme Court nomination, that the confirmation hearings are currently happening. So when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away last month, there was a lot of attention to how will this shape the campaign? Will it galvanize Trump supporters, or will Biden supporters rally, donate money? We saw that he had an increase in his donations around that time. That has the potential to reintroduce some new issues into the debate. For example, abortion as an issue in our society, an issue that is always in our political discussions, but has not been at the forefront. I don't know whether that will happen in this case, but ultimately, the way these events have occurred, they have largely worked to reinforce people's already existing positions on candidates.
I mean, by the way, since you've seemed to identify, I mean, both of you in a sense, the debate as an important element here, my question asks for a bit of speculation. What did you think President Trump had in mind? I mean, was this President Trump being President Trump, or was there a strategy behind this? Speculative question, but I'm interested in knowing what you think.
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that could be asked not only about his debate performance, but about, for example, his decision to leave the hospital while he was being hospitalized and conduct a drive to greet his supporters outside the hospital. His decision to go return to the White House very quickly, and his decision to begin conducting large rallies with his supporters immediately after his return to the White House, and we saw that already in Florida, and more to come. So all these things, I think, raise the question of is there some well thought out strategy here, or is this a reflection of just Donald Trump acting impulsively? And I'm frankly inclined toward the latter theory. I don't believe that there's a well thought out strategy here. I think that Trump is behaving in a way that he feels is consistent with the behavior that won him the presidency 4 years ago. He feels that holding these large rallies and getting his supporters worked up and enthusiastic was what allowed him to win the first time. And he's going to continue doing that, even though the polling data suggests that this is a counterproductive strategy, that his personal conduct in relation to the pandemic is not just his policies, but his personal conduct, his unwillingness to wear a mask, his unwillingness to enforce social distancing at events, such as the event that resulted in multiple infections that took place at the White House a few weeks ago. These are reinforcing the negative perception that most Americans have of his handling of the pandemic, but it doesn't seem to alter his behavior.
Mary, what do you think? Strategy or impulsiveness?
Yeah, so I think that this is part of an approach to make it seem like everything is as normal as it possibly can be in a pandemic. So showing that he is invincible, doing things that generate support from his base. He knows what rallies them and inspires them and gets them worked up. He has figured this out from his first campaign, and he has honed these practices over time. As Alan said earlier, he's not trying to expand his base. If he wanted to expand his base, there are opportunities along the way to change his actions, to follow public health guidance, not just in how he acts, but also at the events that he hosts. So if you're hosting events, here at the university, everybody has to be wearing masks. We have to have social distancing in place. These are requirements here in our workplace. And right now they aren't uncommon requirements throughout the United States, but the failure to do or to follow just the basic guidance of his own health professionals really is a demonstration that he wants the things to look or appear as normal as possible. And perhaps it's a show of strength that he believes he's invincible. When he was hospitalized for the short period of time for COVID, leaving the hospital to do the drive-by his supporters. For most people who are hospitalized with COVID, that is not something medical professionals would recommend, and they certainly wouldn't recommend that you're getting into a car when you're highly contagious with other people. But he wants things to seem like all is normal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add one other point about this, that in my view, the pandemic itself presented Donald Trump with a golden opportunity. That when the pandemic came along, that this was his opportunity to show that he could respond effectively to a crisis, lead the country in a way that would unite most of the country behind him by taking ownership of the crisis, by providing leadership in the response, and trying to minimize the numbers of people who were infected and died as a result. And he failed to do that.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah.
We would have probably seen, if that had happened, the same sort of rally effect that we've seen in other countries, where leaders have enjoyed a surge in popularity and approval because they made a serious effort to deal with the crisis, even though nobody completely succeeded here. Every country has experienced large numbers of infections and deaths, but the United States has actually done considerably worse than most other relatively wealthy countries. So I think, and we've seen this even at the state level in the United States, governors who have taken decisive action to deal with the pandemic have seen their approval ratings rise quite spectacularly in some cases. So here was an opportunity. Trump could have taken that opportunity, failed to do so, and now he finds himself 3 weeks out from an election in which the consensus, at least, is that he's facing a decisive defeat.
Interesting point. I mean, in many European countries, you'll find this sort of rally around the flag. It becomes a national threat. Oppositions really can't do much opposition during a period like this. And it seems that he didn't take advantage of this.
Exactly.
David.
Yeah, I was listening to Alan and thinking, and also Mary, because you're talking about quite a non-traditional campaign by this president in present circumstances. But we last talked about a stable Trump support in anyways, still stable after all this, and a kind of partisanship evaluations of the electorate. May I ask you if there's quite serious threats of the president not to accept the results of the election? Do you think that it will have any kind of effect on the afterall of the campaign and on the election, of course? Mary.
Yes, so I would say as political scientists, these kinds of sort of allegations or threats of not possibly accepting the election result is very concerning. So my own field is comparative politics. And so when we look around the world and we see and look at what are the fundamentals of democracy and successful democracy. Part of this is the legitimacy of elections. And so the act of questioning and repeatedly questioning the overall legitimacy of elections without evidence that there is fraud or other types of misconduct in the election, because there really is no substantial evidence of this in the past. This really works to undermine people's confidence in democracy and confidence in our electoral process. And this also occurred to some extent in the 2016 election. While during the campaign, Trump was alleging that hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants would be trying to vote in the election. And we had election observers, international election observers in the US. There was really no evidence that this was happening on any scale that would have a meaningful impact or even a small impact on the election result. So I think that this really poses a challenge to democracy in the US.
Alan, maybe hearing you on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that these unfounded allegations of large-scale voter fraud, particularly in connection with mail or absentee voting, as well as his consistent refusal to state clearly that he will accept the results of the election, are very troubling. And we've never seen anything quite like this before. At the same time, I would say that, in a way, what we're seeing here is Trump is sort of following what some people have called the authoritarian playbook. It's something we've seen from other authoritarian leaders in other countries. But what Trump is lacking here is many of the other sort of resources that authoritarian leaders need to have in order to actually carry out their plans. So what Trump doesn't have is, first of all, he's unpopular. Second of all, he doesn't have the ability to actually directly influence the voting process, because elections in the United States are conducted by the state. And it's a very decentralized process, which has its own problems. But at the same time, it makes it very difficult for a leader, a single leader like the president, to actually interfere in that process. And therefore, in the end, I don't think Trump's going to be able to stop the vote count, for example, even if it does end up taking several days or longer in a number of states. And I also think he lacks the support from other elites that would allow him to actually block the election results or prevent a peaceful event, what will eventually be a peaceful transition if he loses the election. Doesn't have the support of the military, for example. He doesn't have a national police force that he can use to carry out any of these designs that he may have. He doesn't even really have the support of his own party, because we've heard already from a number of prominent Republican leaders, including the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, that there will be a peaceful transition of power if he loses the election. And so I just am very, very skeptical that he would actually have the ability, the power to actually turn these threats into reality.
Okay, Ellen.
I do think that,
yeah, Mary.
I do
Go
think that I agree with everything that Alan has just said. Election officials are, though, bracing for an increased number of challenges in the vote counting process, and particularly with the absentee counting process. And so there could be these kinds of challenges that would extend the date by which we know the actual result of an election, and may create a certain amount of chaos in the post-election, the immediate post-election period.
Right.
So there is concern about what types of litigation and other issues that will arise immediately following Election Day.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. On the other end, what we have to keep in mind, in many of the states that are crucial in this election, the election officials who are in charge of running the elections are Republican. And I happen to think that although the election results will be delayed in some states because of the need to count absentee ballots stretching out over several days, that I believe on election night, or at least soon thereafter, within 24 to 48 hours, we will know a great deal. And there are a number of key states that count their votes very quickly, even states with large numbers of absentee ballots, including Florida. So Florida and Arizona, for example, two of the key swing states, they process their absentee ballots early. And they have a cutoff for receiving absentee ballots on election day. And therefore, I think it's very likely that we will know the results in Florida and Arizona either on election night or very soon thereafter. And that's true of a number of other states. And so I think based on those states that will be reporting their results quickly or relatively quickly, I think the outcome may very well become clear very quickly, in which case I think these sorts of challenges, may be less relevant.
So,
At least that's what I'm hoping for.
yeah, sure. So, Alan, you've been doing election forecasting for a long time, and this election, I assume you did not fail to forecast this election. Can you tell us about your work about this election and what do you expect to see on the basis of your models?
Well, as Mary knows, I've modified my model for this election. So my forecasting model is a fairly simple one. It includes 3 predictors, and it's predicting the national popular vote, at least in the past. And it was based on the incumbent president's approval rating in the middle of the election year, the growth rate of the economy, real GDP change in the second quarter, and then a variable that just measures whether an incumbent president is running for re-election after only one term in office for the incumbent party.
Time for change.
Time for change factor. So, which also can be viewed as a kind of first-term incumbency advantage. In this election, however, I believe that measure of the economy is no longer relevant because of the way this economic downturn came about, as I mentioned earlier. And I also believe that the incumbency advantage for a first-term incumbent is no longer a factor either. That's partly because of growing polarization. It's not just about Trump. But I think that Trump has also sort of thrown away that advantage of incumbency. So that left me with one predictor, which is a pretty simple model, and that's just the incumbent president's approval rating in the middle of the year. The good news is that when an incumbent is running for re-election, as in 2020, that incumbent's approval rating is actually a pretty strong predictor of both the electoral vote and the popular vote. So in this case, I'm predicting the electoral vote based on what happened in 2016 and 2000. And so I came up with a forecast that essentially said that Trump was a significant underdog, that Biden was predicted to win the electoral vote by a pretty decisive margin. But because of the time remaining between the middle of the year and election day, there was still a chance that Trump could turn it around, about a 30% chance at that point. As we get closer and closer to the election and his approval rating remains stuck roughly where it was at that time, then his chance of turning it around becomes less and less and less. And that's kind of similar to what we're seeing in the 538 model as well, by the way. As the election gets closer, they're showing that Biden's chance of winning the election has gone up considerably, partly because of just the passage of time. So where we are right now, I would say that Trump's chances of winning the electoral vote are probably considerably less than 30%, maybe more like 10 to 15.
Mm-hmm. So, Mary, you are the chair of the American Political Science Association political forecasting group. You know what your colleagues have in mind. I think it's in a couple of days that all these forecasts are coming out. But is there something you can tell us about what the members of the forecasting group generally have estimated for this election?
Yes, I'm happy to. So first I'll put a plug in for the special issue of PS, Political Science and Politics, which will be coming out online on October 15th. And this has a collection of political science U.S. presidential election forecasts. So they will be available publicly and for free in a couple of days. Most of the presidential election forecasts do predict a Biden victory in the Electoral College and or the national popular vote. There is an increased focus this year on actually predicting the Electoral College vote because of the misfires from the 2000 election and the 2016 election. And in these models, they use a variety of approaches, but the fundamentals are presidential approval, economic circumstances, conditions in the states, if they're using state-level models, that at least in the middle of the summer when these forecasts were estimated, really pointed to a Biden victory here. There are a couple models. There are 3 models that are in this issue that do predict a Trump victory. These models are unique in different ways. So one I've already mentioned, Lockerbie's model that focuses on the future of the economy, so economic pessimism or optimism about the future. Another one is Helmut Norpoth has a model that focuses on primaries and how the 2 nominees did in the primaries, particularly New Hampshire and South Carolina. And this his model points to a Trump victory this year. And the third model is what we refer to as citizen forecasting. And this is asking voters, who do you think will win the election? So not who do you intend to vote for, but who do you think will win? And the underlying logic of this is voters, they know who they themselves are going to support, but they also know lots of other information. They might be following the polls, they might be talking to family members and friends about politics, they know the history in their own states, they know how the Electoral College works. And this model points also to a Trump victory. And I think one of the things that's happening there is it points to Americans' skepticism or healthy skepticism of public opinion polls right now because of the inaccurate predictions that the polls gave us in the 2016 presidential election. And so while people may be seeing what the national polls look like, it's also a little bit in their mind, well, there's the Electoral College and this happened last time, so maybe even though the polls might be pointing to a Biden win, perhaps that might not happen.
In the very short time that we have, I think it's perhaps less than a minute, do any of these models talk about the Senate?
Not those models. No, these are all presidential forecasting models. There are people who try to forecast congressional elections, although I'd have to say there's a lot more work on House elections than there is on Senate elections. House elections, because of the much larger number of races and the fact that it takes place in every district in the country, are somewhat easier to forecast than Senate elections, where you have only 33 or 34 or 35 contests, and only about 2/3 of the states actually have Senate elections. So, but yes, there's some work in that area, but it's much less than on presidential elections, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. And in the special issue that I mentioned, there are a couple of models, authors who do both presidential and congressional forecasts.
Well, it's time to go. Plenty of open questions to the election night. It's my pleasure to thank you both, Mary Stegmaier and Alan Abramovitz. Sorry, Alan. And you're welcome to be in Portugal as soon as you can, and the pandemics go. I hope you have a pleasant election night, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting
Thank you very
us.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Goodbye.